Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have the privilege of talking with Brad Torgersen, author of The Chaplains War, A Star-Wheeled Sky, and a ton of short stories. Brad, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for interviewing me.
So the first question I have is, how did you get into writing fiction professionally?
So the genesis of that goes all the way back to 1992. Um, like a lot of 80s kids, I read a lot of paperbacks. I was a science fiction geek. Um, uh, Several different favorite authors. I read a lot of the Star Trek pocket books, paperbacks, et cetera, et cetera. But in 1992, I was listening to a program on community radio station KRCL FM in Salt Lake City every Sunday night that played a lot of electronic music. And the host had started doing kind of this little homespun radio serial that he called Searcher and Stallion. It was completely unpaid community radio. I mean, this was just a for the love of it kind of thing. As a listener, I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. He's trying to do like the old style radio serials. They even had some special effects and they were using the music. And the host, Scott Howard, had a great radio voice for it. So it worked. So I contacted him through what was then the dial up bulletin board he was running for the show. And I just said, hey, I would like to take a crack at scripting for you. So he had me show him some of my fan fiction for just stuff I'd had on my computer disks. So I sent it to him. He said, hey, you're actually not bad. Okay, let's do this. So I ended up doing 12 episodes for Searcher and Stallion. Again, this was complete
Nice.
community radio, unpaid, like just for the fun of it.
Hmm.
But it was while doing this radio serial, I was also reading short fiction by Larry Niven. Larry Niven is a
Hmm.
multi-award winner, New York Times bestseller. And in the back of my mind, I started thinking, Larry gets paid for this. I wonder how much harder I would have to work to try to get paid for this, do it for real, quotes. So long story short is I had to work a lot harder. Uh, from that point forward, I started sending out actual original short stories to the magazines because back in the day, that was the kind of still the recommended way to do it. This was on the old model where you cut your teeth sending short fiction to the magazines. Eventually, you break in with the magazines, and that gets you some cred, and then you take your cred and maybe get a book deal. Blah blah blah. That is essentially how it went. But I didn't realize it would take so much longer to craft, or I should say, work on my craft to the point where I was entry level professional competent at doing stories. So from like 93 until, let's see, when did I win Writers of the Future? 2009, November 2009. So quite a while. But I did eventually win Writers of the Future 2009. And things happened very quickly after that. I sold my other, so I had two stories that were finalists for Writers of the Future. One of them was a winner. The other was not a winner, but I was still insistent that this was a really good story. So I sent it to Stan Schmidt at Analog Magazine. Stan was impressed with it. He said, yeah, I want to buy this and we're going to publish it. And it was published the next year, roughly about the same time I went to the workshop in California. Writers of the Future does like a week long,
Hmm.
welcome to the pros, welcome to the big leagues kind of workshop. It was very cool. I got to meet Kevin G. Anderson, among many other people who are the judges there, big names in science fiction, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, so that story in Analog Magazine ran, got a nice piece of interior illustration. It won me, which I was incredibly proud of, almost more proud than the Writers of the Future Award. It won me my first Reader's Choice Award in Analog Magazine, which was quite a feat. Or so I was told, because I was still a newbie, nobody who knew who I was.
Hmm.
Stan Schmidt was like, "Hey, this is a big deal. We've seldom ever had a newbie come in and have a first story in analog." And of course, at that point, I'd had many dozens of rejections from Stan,
Hmm.
paper rejections, the old half page paper rejections. So being able to kind of crack in with analog and win a Reader's Choice Award right off the bat, like I definitely felt like, aha, I'm having my moment, and I did. Went on to publish many stories with Analog, started getting invited to anthologies. Bain Books, of course, showed a lot of interest. They said, "Hey, when you have books ready, please send us your books," et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, from 2010 onward, it was just kind of a steady flow of not only audience interest but editorial interest. Uh, People asking for stories for anthologies, additional publications in various places. Kevin Janderson's Wordfire Company put out two of my short fiction collections in, I want to say, 2012 and 2013. Those are out of print now. Obviously, it's been over 10 years, but I'm putting a lot of these stories back into print for a new anthology that I'm going to do. 15 of my best stories. It's been 15 years. Time for a 15-year anthology, my
Hmm.
best of work. I'm calling that Footprints in the Firmament, and that should be out this month. I'm almost
Oh,
done getting
really?
all the formatting done and all that stuff. Yeah, so uh, I'll send you a copy if you want, but mostly old hits, old favorites, and a bunch of new stuff that hasn't been collected before. I'm going to be pretty proud of that. In addition to other things I'm working on. Anyway, that's a long version of kind of how I broke in. It definitely wasn't instant. Many years of rejection letters. Um, there was a while there where I just was like, am I even any good at this? Because as much fun as doing the radio serial was, getting all those rejections for years and years, it was
Mhm.
very hard. I mean, the world is telling you maybe this isn't the thing you really should be doing with your time. But my wife had a heart to heart with me in 2005. At that point, our daughter was only a couple years old, and I was working. I was in the military. Life was busy, but she could tell I was frustrated and kind of feeling down. And she's like, "Are you even writing anymore?" And I said, "Well, barely." And she said, "Well, what can you do different, or what do you need to, what do you need to do?" Which was good advice at the time because I did change a few things about the kinds of stories I was writing and sending out. A few years later, yeah, One Writer's the Future, which was a pretty pretty substantial moment, as it is for most Writers of the Future
Mhm.
winners. That really is the starting point of it all, and then life just got busy after that, writing lots of stories and publishing and awards nominations and awards wins and et cetera, et cetera.
So you mentioned that after you started breaking in, that Bain came calling, and you've published a few novels from Bain, which I wanted to ask about. The first is your novel, The Chaplains War, which you were talking about anniversaries. This year's the 10th anniversary of this one,
Correct, correct.
and this is a military science fiction novel. Can you tell us how the idea for this book came about?
So the book is based on two linked pieces of short fiction. There was a short story that appeared in Analog magazine. And then after that, there was also a novella that appeared in Analog magazine. Same characters, same setting, same everything. The short story was called The Chaplain's Assistant. The no novella was called The Chaplain's Legacy. They did very well for me in the magazine, awards nominations, awards wins, et cetera, et cetera. So I got the idea to do, again, I'm patterning my whole process after the old school. And one of the people I met at Writers of the Future is a guy named Mike Resnick, who's no longer with us.
Mhm.
Mike Resnick, long standing, long time science fiction fan, science fiction reader, science fiction editor, science fiction writer, multi-award winning. So he became a mentor after Writers of the Future. Uh, and one of the things that he had talked about what were called fix-up books. So in the old days, decades ago, very often the magazine writers would take, again, one or more stories that were interlinked, and they would flesh them out into a full-blown novel, and then it would get published in novel form as a fix-up book. So that's pretty much what the Chaplain's War is. I took the Chaplain's Assistant and the Chaplain's Legacy, uh, combined those together, and then greatly expanded the story with a lot more detail. Um, the plot of which pretty much stays the same as it does in the book. There's no change to the plot. You just get a lot more detail on the character, the situation, um, how things transpire, what happens afterward, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhat similar, I guess, to what Orson Scott Card did with Ender's Game. That's how Ender's Game kind of went to. It ran in short form in analog, I want to say in the 70s, and then he took it and blew it up into novel form, and then it became Ender's Game the novel, which went on to be, the huge book that it is now.
Well, if yeah, I knew going into the book that it was the fix-up novel type thing,
Okay.
but if I
Okay.
hadn't known that, I wouldn't have known because the book flows well and it does feel like it's like parts like part one of the story, part two, part three, and it as you said, the plot kind of stays throughout, so it felt like a natural progression. So I thought that was really cool. How did you come up with the idea for the kind of insectoid aliens in the book, the mantis?
Oh, it wasn't that hard, and I definitely can't claim that it's an original idea. Bugs have been used as the basis for aliens in science fiction for many decades. Um, Obviously, the mantis is an easy one. It's a large insect. It's a fairly intelligent insect. It's interesting to look at. It's also, if you see them feed, it's rather menacing. I wanted a bug that would be um, when blown up to like full size, human size kind of intelligent creatures that would uh, do both. I wanted them to be intelligent yet also menacing. The mantis was like a no-brainer. Um, Plus, I wanted something that wasn't going to be uh, just like forehead aliens, like in Star Trek. Now, don't
Right,
get me
yeah.
wrong. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, massive Star Trek fan. At least the old Star Trek before the new stuff that's come out the last few years, like Kirk era with Shatner and Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. But I didn't want to do a forehead alien where it's just humans walking around with something minor anatomical about them that's different. I wanted something that would be truly alien, or at least relatively alien compared to people. So that's how I came up with the mantis.
And your character is a chaplain's assistant, as you mentioned, Harrison Barlow. Did you draw from real life inspiration in the military, or did you try to go from more fictionalized route of what that would be like for his character?
So, being in the Army Reserve and deployments and whatnot, and just kind of bouncing around the military, I had run into both chaplains assistants and chaplains. I've always thought that's a really unsung job. Very often the chaplains end up being kind of the shoulder that people cry on out in the field, especially. This was back before the Army was spending its time on any kind of like mental wellness for soldiers. So very often the chaplain was your mental wellness resource,
Hmm.
especially in a deployed environment. And I always admired that. I thought, especially in this secularized age where a lot of people kind of dismiss, religious and spiritual ideas out of hand, or if they are even a little bit friendly to religious concepts, it's in a very fuzzy, non-defined way. But at least in military uh, circles, or at least in my military experience, when people when the rubber meets the road in a military way, people kind of snap to attention, and they start paying attention to these spiritual and religious questions a lot more seriously than many of them did before. For obvious reasons, the military life is austere. It's difficult. Deployments, especially,
Hmm.
can be dangerous, right? Um, and it's just it's a kind of living that many civilian Americans just don't ever experience. And so when you're suddenly taken out of your comfortable American civilian life and you're put into this potentially dangerous, austere experience, it changes you. There's something else I should mention that's very key to the genesis of this whole story. So way back in 2010, I want to say it was 2010, I went to a workshop out in Lincoln City, Oregon, run by Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush.
Hmm.
Uh, so she used to edit fantasy and science fiction magazine, um, award nominated, et cetera, et cetera. So the workshop the nucleus of it was we're going to proceed as if we're building an anthology with a theme, and the theme was a planet too far, and it was kind of like uh, you know, science fiction stories set at the edge of the galactic wilderness, so to speak, and people in privation, people in extreme circumstances on the edge, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of the notion of the anthology. So when I was considering what to do for the workshop story, I remembered a fact about the Vietnam War that had to do with the prisoners of war. And it came out of the Vietnam War that the prisoners of war who were held by North Vietnam, who had some kind of religious belief or religious practice, tended to fare much better in their multi-year captivity than the prisoners who didn't. Um, and that always struck me that the religious underpinning of these soldiers' lives in severe privation and torture and everything they had to go through being prisoners, it helped them. And that had always just kind of in the back of my mind. I thought, wow, that's fascinating that their religious belief really helped them in this dire, extreme circumstance. Again, many of these prisoners were held prisoners for years. So then I thought, well, duh, I have this workshop assignment. It's supposed to be humans living on the edge out in the far-flung frontier of the galaxy. I'm going to write a prisoner of war planet story. So that's what I proceeded to do, and that's what became the chaplain's assistant, because I thought the it would be tempting to write about a chaplain per se, but I thought, no, you know what? I want to tell the enlisted man's story. So chaplains' assistants are charged with basically not only protecting the chaplains in the field. The chaplain wouldn't necessarily carry a weapon, but the chaplain's assistant would, and they would kind of be the Batman or the orderly of the chaplain, out in the field helping them with different things. So I focused on that as my character. He's stranded on this prison planet. The Mantis have captured these humans who basically have no hope of returning to Earth and what's going to happen with them. And the story is told through the eyes of this chaplain's assistant who has kind of picked up the mantle of his chaplain who is now dead. And he's going to carry forward in this prison planet situation where he is going to try to be the stand-in, so to speak. So he builds a little ramshackle chapel, and different people come, and that's where they try to find solace and seek meaning and do the things that prisoners of war we know from historical record actually did in times of uh, in times of war when they were captured. Not just in Vietnam per se, but again, the Vietnam instance is what I remember thinking of specifically for that workshop story. And then, of course, I sent the story to Stan at Analog. He said, "Yeah, this is actually interesting because you're looking at it from a not just a religious perspective, but also a science fiction perspective. Because, of course, the Mantis aliens consider religion to be completely foreign. It doesn't
Hmm.
exist for them. They're like, this is so bizarre that you have this belief in something that can't exist, and we have no way to sense it or test it or scientifically prove it." Which is, I guess, analogous to our modern world, which has the same dilemma, right? We have many, many religious people and many, many non-religious people, and you have the critics, like, of course, probably Sam Harris is the most famous in American circles right now, just because of his podcast stuff and being on Joe Rogan and whatnot. And then, of course, you have religious proponents. I myself am religious, although I've always found the experience to be an experience in duality, because you're constantly asking yourself questions, or at least I have, about what do you really believe, and what are you really willing to profess, things of that nature. So I kind of blended a lot of that into the story of the chaplain's assistant, who, in the chaplain's legacy, the bigger story that appeared later in Analog magazine a couple years later, he gets a much more fleshed out, much more detailed look at his life, which I expanded on even more for the book. We really go into detail about his life on Earth before the war, after the war, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so that's kind of how the book came into being through the short stories and some of the questions I was asking. Um, and a lot of it's pretty deep. It's, again, what is the value of religion? What is the value of believing in God or not? Um, what are some of the difficulties in believing in God or not? Um, what would an alien mind make of our religious belief and the fact that human beings are religious creatures? I think modern times, in an unexpected way, have proven that we are religious creatures because we have stripped, at least in many Western cultures, we have stripped the old classic religions out of daily life to a large extent. We've certainly stripped them out of official life in ways that wasn't true 100, even 200 years ago. But something else will inevitably crowd in and take their place. I certainly think some of the different kinds of zealotry we see has religious flavor to it. Absolutely. Environmental zealotry, sexual identity zealotry, uh, uh, things of that nature have definitely taken over in very religious form. I would almost dare say cult-like form. But I don't want to turn this into a political podcast. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of giving you my mindset. Even as I'm putting the book together 11 years ago to send over to Bain, I really wanted to explore it in even greater detail than I had even in the magazine. And I think I was able to. The book has certainly been a nice calling card for me. Many people continue to buy it, and I keep getting nice fan mail from people who say, this was a remarkable science fiction book. Yes, it was military science fiction, but you came at it from an angle I never expected. It was kind of a deep angle, and it made me think. And so been very pleased with the different fan reactions. You, of course, contacted me and say, "Hey, let's talk about the book on the podcast," and I was very gratified by that. So it's a story I continue to be proud of, definitely.
Well, whenever you can combine entertainment with deeper themes, that usually is the type of book that sticks around because the book is a fun book in and of itself, trying to find out, if Harrison's gonna survive with this, if he's gonna be able to get the humans out of this situation with the Mantis. That in and of itself is a fun science fiction book. But when it's shrouded in the solution is to have all these deep theological like discussions and not just about one religion, about all the religions. And Harrison has to look up information about all of them to be, on his toes and stuff. The conversations themselves were just really fascinating. So yeah, I understand why it's become such a calling card. Uh, you also wrote a book that came out a couple years ago titled A Star-Wheeled Sky, which actually won the Dragon Award. I think was it the Dragon Award for science fiction?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
That's great.
2020. The year was 2019. The awards were actually held in 2020, but yeah, best science fiction novel at the Dragon Award.
That's great. And I was wondering if you can just give like the general pitch for what this book is.
So Star-Wheeled Sky is a fairly straight up science fiction far future book. Um, I wanted to deal with several different themes that I find fascinating, um, such as ancient civilizations. If we get out there in the galaxy, if we're able to ever, what will we find? We might find evidence of civilizations that were around long ago and no longer are. I also wanted to play with the idea of would we be able to understand and adapt some of that ancient technology if we find it for our own use? And I twisted a little bit because I thought, well, in our modern world, most of us don't understand even how like our cell phones or our computers really work. Like if you were to ask someone to build a cell phone from scratch and explain how the 5G works and all this kind of stuff, most people couldn't do it, which is not their fault, right? We just live in a highly technologically advanced society where most of the things we use, we don't really understand them. We might understand some of the rudimentary basics, but we couldn't. Again, very few of us could build a cell phone from scratch.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, it might be the same with some of the alien stuff we find out there in the galaxy, if we can get out there at all. We might figure out how to use it, but we wouldn't necessarily understand how to replicate it. So I played with that idea. Other things I wanted to play with were, and this is again not original to me, was the idea of humanity itself being confined. Part of the dilemma of the book and part of the dilemma of the setting is humanity is somewhat trapped in a very specific bubble of space. They're trapped simply by the physics because the alien technology that they've discovered and learned how to use but don't understand only allows them to travel to a set number of stars in a set region of space. It's a small region of space. They can't really get beyond that. Uh, loading up generation ships and spending centuries going between the stars the old-fashioned way is cost prohibitive and not practical, so nobody does it. People have just settled for getting around on this alien network, which I called the Waywork, how they get from star to star. And so you actually have, different countries that exist within this closed sphere. Some of them are hostile to each other. You have politics, you have monetary problems, trade problems. But the whole reason the book snaps into focus is because for once in the long history of this little confined bubble of human space, a new waypoint, I call them waypoints, or a new star suddenly becomes accessible for the first time ever, which has never happened. So there's a gold rush basically of the different nation states trying to truck in there and take advantage of this and is this a way out? Can humanity finally start expanding beyond this little confined area? Because obviously in a closed environment you have finite resources, and especially if you have one nation state that's very, very aggressive and wants to eat up all the others, you have a competition for control. So I played with that idea as well. Other things I wanted to play with in the book were the notion of um, people being pressed into service who aren't necessarily the best people for the job, but they're the ones who just happen to be there at the time and the place when action has to be taken. To me, that's always been a very fascinating idea because it's true to our history, especially military history. I've always been fascinated by World War II, World War One, the American Civil War, even the Revolutionary War, and back through, going beyond the United States. Very often, wars are fought not with ideal people and ideal soldiery under ideal conditions, but it's almost always just, well, who do you got at the time who is willing to take action? And so I kind of layered that into my process when I created a lot of these characters, both the good guys and the bad guys. Um, Other things that I kind of had on my mind when I was writing the book had to do with culture, obviously. How would the different cultures form and what would they look like and what would they sound like? I kind of have it's not feudal per se, but for my protagonists in the book, Star State Constellar, they're definitely a quasi-royal society. They have a kind of a ruling class that is semi-royal, or at least there are bloodlines involved, and there's family houses involved. You have an underclass too, and how would that figure in? So and I'm kind of riffing a little bit on England during the Edwardian period,
Hmm.
transitioning into the 20th century a little bit, right? Like it's a technological society, and you definitely don't have the royals unchallenged sitting on their thrones because you have other interests, especially business interests, the people who actually make the economy run so that there is actually an economy, they have a say in things too, things of that nature. So all of that kind of blended together just organically as I went through the book and fleshed these characters out. My character process tends to be, whether I'm writing short fiction or novels, I let the characters suggest who they're going to be, with rare exception. And I can't describe, like it's a kind of a hindbrain process where I just let them naturally evolve into who they end up being. And if that means I have to go back and edit chapters so that they're more consistent earlier in the book with who they develop into later in the book, I will definitely do that. And for me, that's enjoyable as a writer because I feel like I'm finding out who these people are as I go. I'm meeting them for the first time, so to speak, just like the reader's meeting them for the first time. So each of these different characters developed in that way. Again, both the good guys and the bad guys. I didn't really have too many set notions of who I wanted them to be per se. But that's true of Chaplains War as well. I did the same thing with that.
So you've also contributed to a lot of short story collections, as we were talking about earlier, and it'd be too much to try to cover all of them. But there's a few of them I want to cover. Specifically, you've contributed to some of the Weird World War books. You contributed to I know you contributed to Weird World War III and to Weird World War China.
Right.
The Weird World War China is the one that just released earlier this year. So actually, it may come out December. But the question I have for you is, what did you do in the process for coming up with the story for this anthology and for the other anthologies that you contributed to?
So the genesis of the story for Weird World War III China, it's actually a sequel to a story that appeared in Analog magazine that was a Hugo nominee back in the day. So the original story in Analog was called, oh gosh, now I got to remember, uh, The Exchange Officers. And it focused on basically teleo-operated robots working in space that a human would pantomime the movement and I played with this idea in the exchange officers as how would the military apply this? We already are using drones and ROVs in the battle space. Of course, with the Ukraine war, everyone's now freaking out about off the shelf drones being weaponized,
Hmm.
things of that nature. So I kind of took that idea over a dozen years ago and I extrapolated it to the space environment. And the heavies in that story were the communist Chinese. It seemed natural. They're very ambitious about, kind of reinventing the space race. They want to become dominant in low Earth orbit and beyond, possibly. So they were the natural heavies, in my opinion. So when I was approached to do, or wait a minute, no, wait a minute, hold on. I got to fix my brain on this. I got to make sure I'm talking about the right story here. Was that the Robo Soldier story? Oh no, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I stand corrected. I'm sorry.
Yours is The Last
Uh,
Ohio, if that jogs your memory.
thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm making an anthology author blunder here. I have been invited to contribute to many Bane anthologies over the years. I
Hmm.
was substituting my Robo Soldier story. You don't have Robo Soldiers there behind you anywhere, do you?
I do not, I'm sorry.
Okay, so here, allow me to plug that one. Let me find that one on my bookshelf. Here it is. So what I was just describing was Robo Soldiers, another
Oh,
anthology I've
right.
got a story in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the story I wrote for that. And again, the communist Chinese are the heavies in both stories. So Robo Soldiers is where I did the Pinocchio Gambit, which was the sequel to uh, the Exchange Officers. I am so sorry. Okay. Let me find uh, Weird World War III China. Okay, here we go. Here we go. This is the one you're talking about, right?
Yep. Hmm.
Okay. Okay, I fixed myself. I didn't make a complete fool of myself. All right. So Weird World War III China was different. Again, the communist Chinese are kind of the heavy, so to speak. But it's really in the background for this one because I remember when the editor contacted me and said, "Hey, do you want to write a story for this?" I was kind of like, "Man, this is kind of going off the beaten path because I'm a science fiction writer. I do military science fiction, but we're blending a lot of fantasy and horror elements into this."
Hmm.
So I went back to an old idea I'd had a long time ago, which basically revolved around, World War III, nuclear weapons, the end of the world kind of stuff. And I thought, well, what would happen if you had one lone nuclear submarine just kind of endlessly wandering the oceans looking for a safe harbor in the wake of the destruction of the United States? So then I took that idea and I kind of blended it into, well, you have ghost ship stories, right? There's always
Hmm.
ghost ship stories. But I thought, what if there's a ghost island? And in the quest for finding a safe harbor, this single remaining nuclear submarine stumbles across basically what amounts to a ghost island, but they don't realize it at first. And then, of course, things proceed from there, and it's fantastic quasi horror,
Mhm.
which is a bit off the beaten path for me because I don't usually do horror. I've done very few horror stories, and the few I have done have always been fantastical. I remember working with Carter Reed, and we did a kind of a horror story that was like a planetary exploration horror story. And I sort of did a few things similar with the one I put into the China book for Weird World War III. Tongue twister that. Um, because I wanted to, think about, well, what would be the practical like if I can put it this way, the spiritual practical implications of the world ending. And I also wanted to play with, how would a bunch of desperate sailors that have been on the submarine for months or maybe even years, and they're just like, man, what are we going to do? Our country's gone. What's left? Where do we find a place in the world now? We're still soldiers. We're still technically serving a country, but it kind of doesn't exist anymore. What does that mean? And then layer in these kind of horrific elements that are only gradually revealed as the story progresses. Um, and in true horror story fashion, I wanted to not necessarily give it a happy ending, which again is
Mhm.
unusual for me. I tend to be a writer who does silver linings in even the worst circumstances for my characters. I chose not to do that for this one, but that's because of the nature of the story. The editor wrote me back, and I had contributed several stories to several of his anthologies he'd done previous, and he said, "No, this is your best one yet. I really like this one." So I was very pleased that straying beyond my author comfort zone paid off for this story in particular. Again, I'm doing the same thing I described earlier with my characters. I am kind of letting them suggest to me who they're going to be as the story evolves, both the good guys and the bad guys. And the bad guys aren't obviously the bad guys at first, although, as told through the eyes of the protagonists, this has to be something that's gradually revealed in the story proper. And again, I apologize for going off on a tangent about the story in Robo Soldiers. Again, I get invited to a lot of anthologies, and sometimes I forget which one is in which book.
You just plugged two stories for the price of one. That's what you
Yeah, there
did.
we go.
The last collection I wanted to ask you about was this Depth Charge collection, which is actually coming out in December from Baen. You have a short story in that collection. I was wondering if you could tell us what kind of the one sentence pitch for that collection is, and then specifically give us an idea of what your story in the collection will be.
Okay, so for Depth Charge, uh, the anthology as it was pitched to me was a collection of underwater science fiction. Anybody that's old enough to remember movies like The Abyss,
Hmm.
no, underwater science fiction is definitely kind of an established subgenre. You don't see a ton of it. Most science fiction is very often, outer space if it's going to go to any kind of frontier, but underwater is also a frontier. My story in particular for this one was previously published in Analog Magazine, December of 2011. It got a beautiful piece of cover art from award winner Bob Eggleton. Um, Basically, the story itself revolves around these underwater habitats that are living at the bottom of the ocean, Earth's ocean. And the way they survive is they stick close to the thermal venting, and they obtain power and electricity by harnessing the energy of the thermal venting, the volcanic thermal venting at the boundaries of the crust plates and all this stuff. So they're deep, deep underwater as a way to escape a global freeze over that has captured the planet. Aliens have engineered a way to block the sun, and so without sunlight, the planet basically freezes over. Humans have no choice but to retreat somewhere. They can't. It's basically modern times. It's a modern story, or at least told in 2011 terms, modern. So where can you possibly go? Well, my solution in the story is for people to retreat to the oceans underneath the ice cap that has swept over the planet once more, and they're subsisting, meagerly and desperately near the volcanic vents, harnessing all that heat to run heat engines for electricity and run their little hydroponics bays for food and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I that one I will definitely be getting when it comes out in December. And then my last question for you is if you have anything you can tease, which you did talk about your collection that you have coming out. Wanted to know if you had anything to tease for what's next, and then also if people want to find you online, any social media or website or anything like that, where can they find you?
Okay. So here's, I don't know if you can see it. So here was the analog where
Oh
Ray of Light was the
yeah.
name of the story. So this was the Bob Eggleton artwork. This story was nominated, and if I remember correctly, it was one of my three Reader's Choice Award winners. So there was the beautiful piece of artwork
Yeah, that's great.
for the story. So that story is going to be in depth charge. Otherwise, the new collection that's coming out, I'm calling it Footprints in the Firmament. It's a 15-year collection, 15 of my best pieces of fiction, both old and new. Some of it will be familiar to people who've already read my previous two short fiction collections that are out of print now. The other half of the book will be new stuff that's appeared in Analog Magazine, excuse me, and elsewhere. So I'm hoping to have that released this month. I've decided, just because of the changing publishing landscape, to actually release this one on my own through Kindle and Amazon's ability to do paperbacks. So hopefully by the middle of the month or so, I'll go live with that. I am going to be guest of honor at Son of SilverCon 2 in Las Vegas in 2 weeks. Or no, I guess about 10 days now. It's Wednesday. So yeah, in about 10 days, I'll be guest of honor at Son of SilverCon 2 in Las Vegas. If anybody wants to meet me there, I'm hoping to have the new collection on hand and be able to sign copies and sell copies if anybody wants to copy, or if anybody just wants to sit and hang out. We'll be doing some panels. We'll be talking science fiction, Baen science fiction in the magazines, all that stuff. Uh, Otherwise, the things I'm working on right now, other than completing Footprints in the Firmament, I'm working on a sequel for A Star-Wheeled Sky that I want to get turned in this summer as well, so that Baen can hopefully publish that. I've had a lot of people asking for the sequel, obviously.
Hmm. Yep.
The Chaplains War was not planned with a sequel. I've been asked a lot if there's going to be a sequel for that. I have a few ideas, but I don't want to do a sequel just for the sake of doing a sequel. I would want to make sure that I've got enough there, if I can use that phrase, before I embarked upon an actual sequel. Although I could just explore that in additional fiction for Analog, which I've thought about doing too. I could pick that up in Analog and do additional stories in that world with those characters. Uh, Other things I'm trying to work on. Nick Cole and Jason Onspach. I've been talking to them about possibly doing maybe 3 books with their label, additional stuff for Baen. I would really like to do additional stories in Larry Niven's Mantis Wars
Yeah.
series. I was really proud of the novella I had in the last book, book number 15. Where is that? I have that around here somewhere too. Oh, here it is. Uh, let me get that. There we go. So Manx and Wars 15. So being a huge Larry Niven fan, at the back of the beginning of the podcast, I talked about how Larry Niven was an influence and an inspiration. So being able to write in his universe, in his known space universe, dealing with not just the Manx Wars, but also the Ring World, was a great treat. A lot of the Larry Niven fans have complimented me on that story in particular. And I also got to share a table of contents with many of my friends and colleagues, like Martin L. Shoemaker. He's award-winning, award-nominated, very, very good analog author and also Baen author. So that was a ton of fun. I would like to do more work in that universe if possible. I kind of feel like I have more work than I can handle. I'm still full-time military.
Hmm.
my daughter's grown and gone out of the house, so I'm not necessarily spending a lot of time on being a dad these days, but I'm trying to, constantly work on my fixer-upper house. Uh, so, DIY takes a certain amount of time. My wife and I are, figuring out what life as empty nesters looks like. So, we're going to take some trips and go some places. We did send her to Europe recently, just as part of she's gone back to school just for the hell of it because she can. At the same time, she's working part-time, but she went to Britain recently, so that was a treat to send her as part of that school program. Um, I myself stand to be on active duty here in the States for a while, so uh, there may be more military science fiction. Again, I might pick the Chaplains War universe back up again. I do have some ideas. I've definitely got some ideas, but I want to let them simmer a bit more before I decide to embark upon it because I want it to be as worthwhile and meaningful as the first stories and book were. I don't want to do it just for the sake of doing it.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the channel.
Appreciate it. It's a treat.
All right. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.